Welcome to the Bill Walton Show, featuring conversations with leaders, entrepreneurs, artists, and thinkers. Fresh perspectives on money, culture, politics, and human flourishing. Interesting people, interesting things.
I want to talk with you today about 4 things that I believe to be true. First, 95% of life's problems can't be solved by politics and government. Next, Occupy Wall Street got the wrong address, and I'll share with you what I believe that address is in just a few moments. Thirdly, politics, as most of you know, has become a business, and the only way to understand politics is to dig into the money and the power incentives. And lastly, the Harvard class of 1968 does not represent a cross-section of the rest of America. And with me to talk about Harvard and these other 3 topics is Haven Pell. Haven is a Harvard graduate and has spent a career as a lawyer, investment banker, foundation director, financial advisor. He's now blogging at Liberty Pell, and his title is Pundificator. And I hope he'll explain to us what Pundificator means in a minute. But first, I want to talk about Harvard with Haven. He was there at his 50th reunion not too long ago and wrote a really interesting essay on it that you can find at his website, libertypell.com, along with a lot of other interesting things he's written on the topics we're going to talk about today. Haven, great to see you.
Bill, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm glad to be here.
So I guess, tell me about Pundificator. It's a great word. Did you invent it?
If you are sort of self-taught in this realm, as I am, you can't take yourself too seriously. And it seemed to me that people who were writing about the topic, about the major business in Washington, where both you and I live, they do tend to they take themselves pretty seriously. And so it seemed like there was room for someone who might write about this, but perhaps not take himself quite so seriously. And so it seemed to me that combining pundit, which there are many, and pontificate, which is clearly a bad thing. I mean, nobody wants to be a pontificator. It seemed to me that combining the two into a sort of a supermax version was a pretty good thing. And it has turned out to be my very best search term on Google. And it remains, I am the #1 pontificator on Google. And so maybe that means something, but boy, blogging is not an easy business.
Well, I can second that. Podcast runs a close second, or maybe even runs ahead of blogging. And yeah, you're certainly right about the solemnness with which most of our friends here in Washington do their pundit business with. It's truer words are never spoken. So you went to Harvard, 68, Regent reunion. First, I want to establish my bona fides to speak with you about Harvard. I went to PS 86 in Indianapolis and graduated from public high school and went to Indiana University, public school in Bloomington. Took me 7 years to get through because I dropped out, got drafted during the Vietnam era. And so I didn't really follow the straight and narrow when it came going through college. But when it comes to Harvard, I spent a lot of my career working with Harvard College graduates and liked most all of them, but some of them worked for me, and I had to fire a couple. So I know the good, the bad, and the ugly about Harvard.
That can happen.
Tell me about the reunion. It must have been fascinating.
Well, it was interesting. In a way, I have thought about what makes it possible for me to pretend that I can add something to anyone else's life on the topic of politics. And I've lived in Washington since 1979, and so the Washington Post has sort of been my newspaper, and it treats politics as sports writers. It's a big sports page for politics, and so
there is a home team.
And there is a home team, yes. The swamp is the home team. And so along the way, from during my various careers, and I'm reading about this, and I'm beginning to say to myself, hey, this doesn't look like it's working very well. And I have my final visit with my a longtime doctor for a physical. He said, quite pejoratively, I might add, that I was an addicted problem solver, and that I know he did not mean that in a good way, although it's completely true. So I looked at this and I said, what am I going to do with my retirement? And I said, I'm going to write about politics. And so I have actually been doing that for 7 years. And, you know, while I may not have all the credentials in the entire world, in terms of being an autodidact and spending 7 or 8 years trying to figure out what these things are and what the answers might be, I've, you know, probably advanced reasonably far in thinking about these issues. So I get to my reunion, and an important aspect of that is I graduated in 1968, and I am now a firm believer that there should be a constitutional amendment that says if you can name anything that happened in 1968, you are ineligible for public office. We're done. My group is done. We've got enough. And it's time for the next team. No more people who can say anything about 1968. And so they decided that they were going to have 4 sessions on polarization. And I thought, wow, you know, if I were looking for one word that pretty much describes what I have been writing about for 7 years, it's pretty much polarization, because it seems to me to be the antithesis of anything that has to do with problem solving. So I say to myself, wow, this is going to be great. I'm going to go to these 4 sessions on polarization, and I'm going to hear about from wonderful people that are smart and have had wonderful careers and have been extremely successful in everything that they've done. And this is going to be a real eye-opener. I suppose with that set up, it's pretty easy to see the punchline was, it wasn't.
Well, I guess one of the key signs was one of the panels had Linda Greenhouse, who was the court reporter, Supreme Court reporter for New York Times, and she had an armband that said "resist," along with a couple of the other panelists.
Yeah, I thought that was notable. I mean, in theory, at least the way I looked at it, it seemed to me that the better view is that polarization is bad. And it's not bad for everyone. It seems to me to be bad.
By polarization, you mean the right-left polarization?
Exactly.
The contact sport we see in Washington.
Yeah. And it seems to me that is, if you prefer running a country, then pushing people to the edges of agreement where they fall off the cliff and they're not able to agree on anything can't be a good way for democracies to run themselves or republics to run themselves. And so it seemed to me that I would hear that polarization was a bad thing. I think what I did hear was that there was an easy solution to polarization, which is everybody has to think like me. And this was true of many of the speakers. There was a marginal effort to have a few people who were not speaking from a progressive perspective. By the way, many of whom were eloquent and thoughtful, not least Tom Reston, a guy who lives here in Washington and has written a very interesting take on the history of the Democratic Party and sort of how it's lost its way. And I thought that was really excellent. And I thought that there were some observations that were useful, but it was very much overcome by things that one might just see on the internet. Picture four 4 sessions, 4 one-hour sessions, 2 of which were devoted to sort of diagnosing the problem, and 2 of which were devoted to solutions. And imagine, say, 350, 400 people in each session. They were obviously self-selected. There were over 1,000 people at the reunion, and maybe others were smarter than me and decided that they would not bother with those sessions. It was a little bit surprising to see what you describe of Linda wearing the resist armband. And she was not alone. There was another person on the panel with the same armband, which they have a perfect right to wear. That's fine. Except it doesn't send the best message about being anti-polarization.
Can I confess to not paying attention to something? I see resist. What do they mean by resist? Who are the?
Well, I think it's very resisting? Much a resist Trump.
Okay.
And by the way, I mean it's not that Trump doesn't deserve to be resisted. There are aspects of his demeanor, and I think we've seen quite a bit of that going on this past week, that are definitely pretty suspect. And there are certainly people who have very legitimate criticisms of the way he goes about his job.
Well, you and I have talked about this before. We were going to, Arnold Kling's been a guest on the show, and we was going to come on today and had a head cold, so we'll get him back. We'll all talk together. But he talks about the 3 languages of politics and how the three tribes really have 3 separate moral codes. The progressive, liberal have one code, the conservatives have another, and libertarians would have a third.
Yeah.
And there's a liberal consensus about what's right and what's wrong. And it sounds like there was like 99% convergence about that in that room or during those panels. And then the other divide that I see, and there was a book written, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago by an author named Angelo Codavia, which I recommend, called The Ruling Class. And
okay.
that is a little different take. And it says this hypothesis is the polarization is not just left-right, but it's also the elites versus the rest of the country.
I think that's entirely fair.
The rest of the country, I think that explains why Trump got elected. Absolutely.
I couldn't agree more. And I think one of the things that you're seeing now is people like, well, one that comes to mind, obviously there are any number of books that endeavor to explain how non-Washington thinks, some of which I think are less useful, but obviously there's a good deal of effort that is going on. James and Ann Fallows deciding that they're going to go see what the heartland of America looks like. And
did they wear pith helmets?
Well, they did it very interestingly. They went to certainly not primary cities. They went to very much secondary cities. Yeah. Now, they did go by airplane. He flies a plane, or they both do. And they would pop down in some place in Sioux Falls or wherever it was, and then they'd spend a week wandering around town and trying to find out what was going on, and so forth. And I'll bet it's a good book. I mean, I did
get in touch after you step off your
Arkansas.
Get in touch after you step off your Gulfstream.
Yes. Well, this is a propeller plane. And
okay. All right.
I was a little bit jealous because I did the same thing last winter. Partly to go to see a friend in Arkansas and see some things that were going on in the Arkansas Delta, which is a pretty challenging place at the moment. And also to travel around in the West under the guise of a massive ski trip, and but also to do what my wife pejoratively referred to as my Jack Kerouac thing, and it was interesting, and I think a lot of people.
I want to specify you don't drink, so
no,
not complete Jack Kerouac.
And there were no controlled substances in there, and so. I think a lot of people have become interested in what is going on in the rest of the country, and maybe this elitism that everyone around us is accused of, maybe there's some truth to that, which it strikes me there is. And I mean, in a way, that's kind of what leads me to the idea that Occupy Wall Street got the wrong address. And
what is the right address? I left that hanging out there. I knew the answer, but I wanted you to dig into it, because that is your idea, and I believe it's absolutely right.
I was asked to write an essay for something called the Passy Press, and the Passy Press is a website located in Paris. It's named after Ben Franklin's press when he was the ambassador before the revolution. And it is an invitation only. I think it's maybe 300 or 400 subscribers, something like that. But it's a pretty upscale group of subscribers. And you are invited to write an essay. It must be 1,000 words or less, and it must come to a conclusion. It must have a recommendation. You can't just lob a problem out there and walk away from it.
That would be a highly unusual piece then, because that's most of what punditry is.
Yeah, and so I said, I looked, and obviously Occupy Wall Street, it sells great. The top 1% is taking all the resources that exist in the country. The rest of the country has nothing. We feel like victims, and you know, it's a wonderful political issue. But to some degree, it is a manufactured political issue to get people mobilized. And who manufactured it? Well, the people who get people elected. And the elect me industry is different from the govern us industry. And most of America, it seems to me, looks at govern us as the point of politics, but not the people who are in it. They look at elect me as the point of the whole exercise, and that's the business. If you look at statistics that tell you how much gets spent from all sources, and it's very difficult to find this because it's not meant to be easy, it's very difficult to find it, but it's billions of dollars per cycle, many billions of dollars, increasing numbers of billions of dollars. And
Which is the third point I made in the intro, which is that politics is a business, and you can't really understand knowing about the money.
And you know, if you look at here's an example. There's a hearing for Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh is going on. The higher likelihood is that Brett Kavanaugh is going to be confirmed. Brett Kavanaugh is clearly a capable lawyer, found to be entirely qualified by the American Bar Association, which is not generally thought to be right-leaning. And he, in all likelihood, will be a fine Supreme Court justice. There are issues that people can be riled up about, but these are entirely unpredictable. Nobody knows how he's going to vote on anything, and there is ample precedent with prior justices that they changed their stripes entirely. There are many examples of that. Yet we have completely orchestrated protests going on. The hearing is not a hearing at all. It's a stage. There's no point in focusing on Kavanaugh. The thing to do is to take the cameras and turn them around and focus on the several people who think that they're in the running to be president in 2020. They're posturing, they're setting themselves up, getting themselves some airtime, and so forth. And then the protests are clearly organized and paid for. These are not spontaneous. All you have to imagine if you look at a protest, I've gone down to the mall and looked at either the befores or afters or durings of protests, and you say, where did all the bathrooms come from? Where did the barriers come from? Did they fall from the sky? No, these have to be organized, and there are people who are very good at it. And it's part of the process of the K Street, you know, changing public opinion and mostly aiming to get people to fight with each other, because that's how you make the most money.
Well, yeah, you polarize each side, and then you get everybody excited, and they write checks, and there comes your revenue. We talked about, you mentioned the top 1% and how Occupy Wall Street got the wrong address, and it is K Street. I believe it's true, but 4 of the top 5 wealthiest counties in the United States surround Washington, D.C.
They do indeed. They do indeed. And
so it's not only the power in Washington, but the money's in Washington. And,
sure. It's there's obviously, there are a lot of, there are some wealthy counties dotted around in the throughout the United States. I'm sure Pitkin County, Colorado, where Aspen is probably pretty high on the list. And there are obviously ones in Silicon Valley and around New York City and so forth. But the counties that are here where you and I live, and Washington, D.C. doesn't count as a county, but if you could take Northwest D.C. and call it a county, that would be another one that would be very high on the list. And this is all people that are making a very good living off of governing or getting people elected.
One thing you said I'd like to dig into a little bit more. You said it's the get elected the crowd versus the govern us. I'd say most of America would say govern ourselves. I think most of America would say,
good point.
Leave us alone. And instead we've got all the stuff that's coming out of Washington, and it's unrelenting. I'm president of our volunteer fire and rescue out in Rappahannock County, and the fire chief there, Ann, talks all the time about the unfunded mandates that come through the fire and rescue system, where she says, I used to run calls, I used to save people's lives, I used to fight fires. Now I'm filling out forms, I'm filling this regulation, that regulation. So what comes out of DC has permeated every facet of American life, and that's I don't know how we roll that back, but we got to figure out a way to do that. Was there any incentive to do that at the Harvard reunion? Did any of the panels talk about the need to?
No. And if you were trying to make the case for centralized decision making, the case that you would probably make would be homogeneity, predictability, and fairness, and that everybody gets treated the same. The case that you might make against that is inflexibility, non-responsiveness, and you could be where you would like to be on that axis. Washington definitely wants to be at the former end of it, because that means they're making all the decisions. Where if there has to be a regulation about your volunteer fire department, where does somebody go who wants to influence that regulation? Well, they can come here, and it's kind of one-stop shopping. If they had to go and sell whatever service they might want to do to your volunteer fire department, do they go to Washington, Virginia, and do they chat with the person that you were describing and say, here's what we can do? Or do they sell their service by putting it into a regulation that you more or less have to buy that service?
Well, that question answers itself. We haven't had anybody show up at our doorstep saying, what do you need or don't need? And but it's interesting. You're talking about a phenomenon I've written and talked about elsewhere, that there's a circle of power and influence that keeps sucking everything into Washington. In 1960, before a lot of these programs came into existence, there were only a handful of companies that had an office here to lobby in Washington. And yet, as the EPA got created, the Great Society created a lot of labor laws and things like that. Pretty soon, businesses felt like they had to be here. Now you can't find any major corporation in America that doesn't have a significant presence here in Washington, spends a lot of time here. And to your point, if you want to make things happen, this is the tip of the spear. And
sure. And And, I've often imagined, I mean, you're much closer to this than me because you've been a CEO and I sure as hell never have. And it seemed to me that I have this vision of a board meeting, and I'm picturing the CEO and I'm picturing the board members and I'm picturing some beleaguered CFO or budget officer or whatever, endeavoring to justify the amount of money that the company is going to spend on lobbying. And then I imagine the entire board of directors bursting into laughter as they consider what the return on investment of whatever it is that they are spending on lobbying being higher than the return on investment of anything else the company does. And that it would be immediately approved. Whatever amount of money you want to spend on lobbying, spend it. It is going to pay dividends.
There is, I'm trying to rack my brain for some of these examples because I've talked about elsewhere. But yeah, I mean, there's instances where industries spend $50 million on lobbying a particular regulation, and then when they get it in place, they reap billions and billions thereafter. Look at the money spent on ethanol lobbying.
Sure.
I happen to believe that ethanol is not a great additive to gasoline, yet the money that the corn industry spent on getting that into gas has paid itself. It's probably produced a 500 to 1 return on the money.
And it explains the Iowa caucuses.
It does. Although, did you see that California now is trying to get ahead of Iowa?
Oh, I didn't know. I didn't know that, but
Yeah.
I've always thought, yes, I can explain why an early stop in campaigning is to go to Iowa, participate in the caucuses, take the pledge, and that's what they call it, that you can't have an alternate thought on ethanol. You have to take the pledge, or you will lose in Iowa. And
well, that's one of the reasons I like Rand Paul in that particular election. Is maybe it was Rand Paul or was it Ted Cruz? They went into Iowa and said, I don't think ethanol should be subsidized. And then I think they finished 6th.
Yeah, well, that's, it's.
And that's the interesting thing. People think the cronyism that occurs here is it's the big companies doing it. It's greedy capitalists. Well, I'm sure that's partly the case, but you've got virtually every faction in America has got some skin in the game, and the game is here in DC. Which gets us back to one of the first point I make, and I think you touched on it. Most of our problems can't be solved by politics or governments. I mean, the real problems. I mean, the life and death problems. The whether you lead a happy life problem. Whether you feel like you're taking care of your family. Whether the things that are close to your heart and close to yourself. Government can't, and politics can't. And yet we act on the presumption, and our media covers it as if we get this one bill passed and people are going to live happily ever after. It never happens.
No. And I hadn't thought about it in this way until you just mentioned it, but there's a whole world of counting stress points. And you've probably heard about this, that there are certain things that if your stress level gets up too high, it can actually adversely affect your health. And there are certain items that are big contributors. Getting a divorce might be, a loss of a family member, loss of a job, any number of things. And if you look at the biggest stress points, the biggest contributors to stress, not one of them is political. It's all sort of family, job, financial reversals. Those sorts of things are the biggest contributors to problems. And politics really doesn't do anything about any of those things. And there's another piece that I think is really interesting, and probably we'll write about it at some point in the future, and that is borders don't work anymore. And if you think about how borders were intended to work, from the time of the Treaty of Westphalia, sorry to be a bore about that one, but
1646.
It's 15 something, I think. A long time ago. It's several hundred years ago. We've been living in this.
Just acting like I knew something.
Yeah, we've been living with this for a long time.
Right. Okay.
And, you know,
the Treaty
if
of
you were
Westphalia
saying
was about
what a country was supposed to be,
Yeah.
it's basically, if you and I had the only two countries, I say, Bill, you know, I'm not going to bother you or your country.
Yeah.
And you agree that you're not going to bother me or mine. And by the same token, I will also make sure that the people who live in my country are not going to bother you. And you'll do the same for me. And that worked fine in the 1500s. Now, it doesn't work fine. Now, you can't stop people from traveling. You can't stop ideas from traveling. You can't stop shipping. You can't stop exports. You can't stop. Logistics have been a much more bigger contributor to the change in our lives than politics have. The fact that we can ship containers all over the world at low prices is one of the biggest factors that there is.
Well, that's kind of in the idea. That's what I believe is that somebody like Steve Jobs has done more to help human happiness than the last 500 politicians you can name. And
Absolutely.
you get some extremely exciting innovations driven by somebody who may or may not be a nice guy, but it changes the shape of human reality, and that's what happens. Politics doesn't do that. Politics is zero sum. It doesn't create. It just divides.
Well, you know, I always think about, have I ever met an African fisherman? No, never have. Do I picture the African fisherman? Yeah, I do. He's on his boat and he catches his fish. And today, he picks up his cell phone. He looks to see whether if he pulls into this port, what price is he going to get for his fish? If he pulls into that port, what price is he going to get for his fish? And he didn't used to be able to do that. And it has aided prosperity in an enormous way. And, you know, it was interesting. Not many months ago, I was at a talk given by the head of the World Bank. And he had a very optimistic view of what we have been successful in doing over the course of the last 50 years. We have lifted more people out of poverty in the world in the last 50 years than has ever been done in all of human history by a huge margin.
And what was the number? About $1 billion, 2 billion? I mean, it was an astonishing. I know that.
It's a breathtaking number, and you know, it used to be that the definition of poverty was $1 a day. And this guy, I mean, he's speaking and he's being very candid, and he said, you know, with $1 a day, we ran out of poor people. The World Bank needs poor people, and so we raised it to $1.25. And still, we ran out of poor people.
Well, that's a topic.
Now we're at $1.95.
That's another.
We still have a declining number of poor people. So we're doing a great job. And yet you aren't allowed to hear the aspects of life in which we are doing a great job.
Well, that's the problem with most of these social programs is that if the problem gets solved, they got to figure out a way to redefine the problem to stay in business. And that's essentially what's happened. And that creation of wealth happened because of what happened in the private sector. It didn't happen because, I mean, the government may have helped at the edges, but not fundamentally. But that what you just mentioned is something we ought to talk about at length in another show. We need to wind up here.
Okay.
My take. Well, why don't you wrap up? And how do you see final words?
I wish I knew how to fix it. Another topic that I've been interested in is devolution and pushing decision making to the lowest.
Devolution.
Yeah.
Moving power out to the.
I think that
right.
I think you described it beautifully with regulations for your volunteer fire department, and that would be sort of devolution writ large. When you go from Washington to the volunteer fire department, that's a pretty long way. But I've often wondered whether there are moments where those in central government have a moment of self-reflection and ask themselves, what did we do wrong to create this problem? Why do people in America hate the elites so much? Not all people, but some people. The other one that interests me is to imagine a conversation in Brussels in which a group of high-level European Union officials ask themselves, would there have been anything we could have done to keep Brexit off the ballot?
Mm-hmm.
What did we do to make them mad enough to pick up that ball, turn it into a political issue? You know, it isn't necessarily that the EU caused Brexit, but there were people who could exploit a fertile field that was created. And the fertile field that's created in the United States is people hate Washington. Polls, terrible. Nobody likes Congress. Nobody likes the executive. Nobody likes the government. They're doing an absolutely awful job. Nobody would invest in a company that had that kind of popularity or support from the people that they depend on. And what could you do to counteract the desire to centralize the power here? And I don't know. I don't have an answer.
Very, very thoughtful framing of the problem. And let's go off and ponder that and come back in a future show and see if we can't take a stab at a few answers. That's great. Haven, it's great talking with you as always. We've enjoyed our conversations over the years. We finally get to do it via Zoom, and this has worked out well. Thank you, and thanks for listening in. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Want more? Be sure to subscribe at thebillwaltonshow.com or on iTunes.